Okay, welcome everyone to this really exciting session that we're going to be having today, talking about and reflecting critically on the recent movements for racial justice over this past summer. We have some really wonderful panelists and persons to engage in a really important conversation. So we really are grateful for all of them. I'll be introducing them in a moment. Just a word or two about our role. What we are going to be doing for the session today is focus on our conversation with the panelists for about 45 minutes or so. And then our moderator will move us into a time of open discussion where you will be able to post your comments or questions in the chat log. And one of us will make sure that James gets that question. And there may be an opportunity for you to speak up as well. We'll just kind of see how it goes. We have a pretty sizable group, so sometimes the bigger it gets, it's a little bit harder to manage. So I will go ahead at this point and introduce our esteemed panelists that are joining us, great friends of Inside Out. And first of all, I'll introduce Ajima Olegre, who teaches criminal justice at Temple University. And she's been, again, a great friend of Inside Out over the past couple of years. It's been really great to get to know Ajima, and she's spoken at a number of events this summer and has made some really important contributions. So thank you, Ajima, for joining us today. Also want to introduce Janet Wolf. Janet Wolf is a long-time Inside Out instructor. She's taught Inside Out in 3 different states through many different institutions. She's been a strong supporter of our executive committee at Inside Out, and she's also now with the Children's Defense Fund. So Janet, really grateful that you're joining us today.
Thank you.
And next we have our third panelist, who is probably pretty well known to a lot of you, especially if you're Inside Out instructors. You may have met him because he was one of you, one of the people that helped, that was in a critically important part of your education and training for the Inside Out Training Institutes. So this is Kempis Ghani Songster, who's joining us, a longtime member of the Greaterford think tank, which has been so critically important in contributing to our Inside Out trainings and building our network. So Ghani, we're really grateful that you were able to join us today. And lastly, I want to introduce our moderator, who is James Forman Jr. James, of course, has been a friend of Inside Out for many years, and he teaches at the Yale Law School in Connecticut. And I think he just suffered a loss of power due to the hurricane that is moving northeast, but he is still with us and is going to be moderating this conversation. I just got a message from, is James still with us? I just got a message, something about his cell tower is down. Okay, okay. Good timing, huh?
Then.
Well, we do have a backup plan in place.
Yes, we do.
Lori is going to be assistant moderator, and we'll take over, and hopefully we'll get James back in a few seconds. Lori has the questions laid out before us. Our panelists have been thinking about them. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lori. And just before I do that, just remember to please mute yourself or mute your mics just to avoid any background noise, but we promise we will allow opportunity for conversation and participation a little bit later. So Lori, without further ado, take it away.
Okay, I do hope that James rejoins us soon because I have not prepared for this. But so let's start with this question. And Ajima, I wonder if we could start with you. Lots of people are saying that this moment of protest and activism feels different from anything that they can remember. Would you say that you agree with that? And if so, what seems different? And if not, then why not?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a great question. And to be consistent about this point that I made earlier, and it goes into the, answering the question about, is this a movement or a movement? I wholeheartedly believe that this is a movement. There are differences and variations in terms of who's involved, including, especially the greater prominence of women, young people, and more non-white individuals as well as white individuals. But I think in general, when you're talking about, is this different? For me, it's sort of a larger issue of, this is a continuous movement throughout our human history of people pushing back against systems and structures that are ultimately oppressive. And sort of my, recollection of if this is different only goes back to, let's say, Rodney King, right? Prior to that, when you think about movements throughout history that we learn about, civil rights movement and, just abolition, Reconstruction, it's definitely before our time. But I think looking at that context, this is consistent with what humanity has always done, which is to push back against systems that are oppressive, that are dehumanizing. And I think we're just in another successive wave of that. And for me, the larger question then becomes, in some sense, this isn't different. We're just part of an evolution of the same movement for liberation for humanity.
Okay, so it's another step along the way.
Precisely. And I think the hope is that future generations don't have to, we can sort of conquer this. It's kind of like it's this peculiar game that we play with ourselves, that we have the lesson of history to teach us. We have the current moments to teach us that what we're doing right now isn't working, isn't right, needs to change. But the collective history in our consciousness and just globally, for some reason, doesn't bear enough weight upon those of us who are in positions of power to change things, to do something that's different structurally. And so I think it's just, we are part of the successive generations, part of the continuous movement throughout history to change, how we relate to each other as human beings, how we treat people, particularly people who deviate from what is considered the norm or the standard.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Janet, would you want to either respond to what Ajima was saying or just take on that question yourself?
Sure. It's great to see so many folks that I know, and I'm really excited about being connected. I think it's a both and. I agree, Ajima, that this is one long continuous resistance movement. I also think there are some things I haven't seen in a long time. I'm the elder in the group, a member of the National Council of Elders, so folks who were back then organizing in the streets, and we're still here. And I think just watching, for example, John Lewis's funeral, hearing Jim Lawson, who will be 92 in September, who has been on the news, who has come back out into the streets to say, this is it. This is the moment when change is not only possible, it's happening. I think in Nashville, we remember in 1960 when Diane Nash and C.T. Vivian led the silent march to confront the mayor after the bombing of Luby's house. And I think there were more than 3,000, that was 1960. And in July, we had 10,000 young folks in the streets, organized by 6 young women, 14 to 16 years old. I mean, that's stunning. Wow. That's just, for those of us who have been waiting a while for this thing to grow larger, to dig deeper, to really confront and make possible systemic change, it's like hope with flesh on it. I see new possibilities than I've seen before.
And you know, or knew a lot of folks back then, right? In Nashville?
Still do, yeah. I knew a lot of folks back then. I think Donnie, when last time I saw you, you met Gus Newport. So we're still hanging around with folks who were working with Malcolm X, with folks who were working with Dr. King. I work with Marion Wright Edelman, who was the first Black woman admitted to the Mississippi bar, who was a lawyer with Dr. King. Those folks who invested in the 50s and 60s, many of whom are still here, are still active, still looking at this intergenerational, multiracial, rooted in some form of spirituality, thick movement happening at this moment. And I think we have lots of conversations that we are having as we accompany young folks, not to tell anybody what to do, but to say, you know, we're here, we got your back. whatever you need, we're there for. And I think that's what's going to be coming in. I'll save that for later. But I just think dangerous times are ahead of us, and that it's really clear to see this as a different moment in the history of our nation. Not that it's not a continuous resistance, not that we're not seeing the same white supremacist violence, but there's some new things coming, I believe, around the corner.
Okay, thank you. So, Connie, would you like to pick up? You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, and just carrying the spirit of the two, the two previous responses from Ajima and Janet. What we see is the continuation of a movement that began with the first, African that bolted, into inhospitable areas to get away from life on the plantation. Maroons, maroon struggles, the struggles of indigenous people and indentured white servants, forming coalitions, like the Dismal Swamp Maroon Wars from Virginia to North Carolina, 150 years, the Seminole Wars, the Underground Railroad, and anti-colonial struggles in South America and in Africa and all of these different places. This is just the continuation of that. It's kind of like how we hear, movements for social change proceed not in a straight line, but in a zigzag fashion. In other words, stony is the road we trod, and that road is characterized by fits and starts and periodic stagnation and loss of steam, big and small victories, major and minor defeats, setbacks and mistakes. And we've seen that. And this is just one of those really intense moments in that struggle. But even if we narrow it down to like this particular thing, Black Lives Matter, that movement started in 2014. And here it is again. So I think it's safe to say that it is a movement. Already we've seen changes like the University of Minnesota, for instance, had cut off ties with the police, right? Right now, the rallying cry is defund the police. I think I saw one time, it was in an illustration that said it best. Favorability ratings, Donald Trump, 42%, Joe Biden, 45%, defunding the police, 54%. I mean, this is unheard of. The mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, because of the pressures of the movement, agreeing to defund the police by 150 million. New York agreeing to defund the police by 1 billion. Minneapolis already making moves to dismantle the police force. And then the solidarities that we see being built, not just here, but all over the world. Israelis and Palestinians protesting together by the thousands in Tel Aviv. You know what I mean? People surrounding, making circles so that Muslim protesters can pray. Nurses getting out there and protesting. Bus drivers refusing to transport people that's been arrested for protesting to prison, or even transport the police. Statues coming down. While some of it is symbolic, but I think the changes that have been made over the last 4 months are so drastic, you know what I mean? And so acute that it's evident that things will not be the same again. And then every time it seems like the thrust of white supremacy is not gonna stop. And every time Donald Trump opens his mouth or the police respond to these things, it continues to fan the flames. And so, oppression is gonna continue to breed resistance. And I'm not saying it's going to be always as intense as it was the first week of the uprising. But again, this is pitted a bit against the backdrop of a global pandemic, the second wave of which is coming. And we don't know how that is going to stoke things again. I think we're in a scenario right now that's just like, I don't know where we're going, but it doesn't look as if we're going back to the way things were. We should.
Okay, let me ask this. James, is James on? James, are you here? I guess not. Okay. So let me, the questions that I'm asking were actually developed by James. So when it says I, it's in his voice. So related to the previous question, I've heard people, and I've often felt myself, a sense of optimism based on how much activity I see in the streets and how that's translating into concrete action in government, universities, corporate America, et cetera. Donnie, you were starting to go there. What are you seeing out there that gives you hope? Any one of the three of you can begin. What gives you hope?
Go ahead, Gandhi. Were you gonna?
Yeah, I mean, the solidarity, you know, it's as if, what gives me, this, it seems to be like this is a great moment of many things, but one of those things is clarity. It's a great moment of clarity, not just about what works and doesn't work, what hasn't been working, but about where everybody stands in this moment, right? Where everybody stands in this moment. I think this is a moment where there is no neutral position. Kind of like what Miles Horton and Paulo Freire said in that conversation that became that book that we read in our trainings, You Make the Road by Walking, that there's no such thing as the neutral position because the neutral position reinforces the dominant position. And so we're seeing that there's no, you have to pick a side in this moment, and everybody is picking a side. Even people in professions that normally require objectivity. Nurses, doctors, academics, everybody is picking a side. History will not be unclear about where each of us stood in this moment and in this lifelong struggle. And I think that's what's given me hope. You know what I'm saying? That the lines are drawn and there's no middle ground, no fence straddling, no gray areas is being allowed in this moment. No obfuscation, no obscurity is being, everything is crystal clear. And everybody is letting it be known where they stand at. I think that's what's giving me hope. And I'm out there on the streets and I'm seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Shannon?
One of the things that I've been most hopeful about is the people's participatory budget processes. So folks who normally would have nothing to do with local government or state government, wading in and trying to figure out what the budget process means and really holding folks accountable to explain it and to be involved in that and to have that led by people who are hardest hit by the unjust policies, people who are directly impacted and who just won't stay silent, just keep pushing. So the Southern Movement Assemblies, I think particularly in the South, some of the organizing work has been striking because the risk is huge for many of these folks in small rural communities. And yet they're taking them. And they're doing stuff that folks would argue they have no knowledge to do, they have no right to do, they have no background to do. And they're doing it. And they're doing it with a sense of power and clarity. Yeah, I'm excited.
Mm-hmm.
I think just, going off what Janet and Gandhi said, what gives me hope is a greater spirit of inclusion. So the importance of recognizing that people and individuals who have been excluded in our society historically, there's greater recognition of their humanity, which systems like the criminal justice system actually, sort of destroys, eradicates in some sense. So recognizing people in their humanity, but also being inclusive in that regard. And, to Janet's point about, rural communities, I'm in Idaho Falls, Idaho. So I'm definitely surrounded in a rural area. And being a Black person in a predominantly area, what gives me hope is that I can walk into a store at a Target and be related because of the color of my skin, but because people are aware. And normally I'm someone that might stereotype this area as a place that it's not welcoming, it's not a place I should be. But even over here, there were movements to protest against police brutality. There was a Black Lives Matter march here. To see that perhaps for the first time in my life thus far, and based on what I know historically, that I can actually sit on the sidelines and actually work with the next generation move this forward. And so to see that there's an inclusive spirit behind this is very important, particularly when we're talking about movements and solidarity and whose voices should be heard in these sort of this sort of time. So that gives me a lot of hope that I feel like this is not so much the work of a few, but many.
Mm-hmm.
I think another thing, if I can jump in, that gives me
Sure.
hope is the art, the music that's coming out, the murals, the painting in the street. Just the art is always a part of movement, making change happen. And it's vivid right now. It's everywhere.
Well, also the humor that's coming out. There are some very funny things that have been sent around, by email, etc. So this next question flows very, very well from what has been talked about. At the same time, of course, there are reasons to be worried. Oops. Okay. Technology. At the same time, there are reasons to be worried that this might remain just a moment rather than a movement. There's a lot of what James called performative anti-racism that seems disconnected from any commitment to lasting structural change. So on your less hopeful days, what concerns do you have about this movement not lasting?
I'd say one of the major concerns, Janet, did you want to go ahead?
Go ahead.
One of the major concerns I have is that complacency. We just revert to the norm, our natural routines, but also that we can confuse the material and structural success of a few as that we've made it. One of the things that I was going to mention that gave me hope that I just recalled was that this was Lori, I might have talked to you, Dave, about this, maybe Eileen as well, that I was encouraged that the Rockefeller Foundation sought to extend capital and loans to a lot of Black-owned businesses, something that African Americans have historically been excluded from in terms of talking about broader, participation in the American economy and building wealth and be able to create that generational wealth to sort of compete in this society. But what concerns me is that where you do have instances of that, where it's just few, we just settle on just cutting up the pie instead of continually growing the pie. So in some sense that there's an end point to this movement, that I can retire at 60 and I'm done, when really this is probably lifelong work. And I guess what I'm saying is that, I think in this sense, and I think I'm recalling Twain here, is that if we somehow become comfortable and complacent, and part of that means that, to what extent do we maintain a connection to those communities and individuals that have yet to reach that threshold or to transgress a lot of the systems that do keep people excluded.
Yeah, I would add, I was talking with the director and lead Southern organizer for SURGE, standing up for racial justice. They had 100,000 new people join in the month of June. I think it was June or May. 100,000 people in 1 month. And these are white people who have not been involved in anything before. They are both a danger and a concern and a hope, right? Because they're folks who have no movement background, have no context for analyzing white supremacy, let alone white privilege, want to race into the streets, take over. Now they know, they're going to be in charge. And so that, is an opportunity. It's also a concern about how it is we build deep relationships with folks who are new to movements in ways that invite them to be partners, but not take over, in ways that invite them to listen, but not pronounce, in ways that invite them to build the context for where this comes from and where it might go. I think the other thing is that so many folks who are in the streets are tired. And as poverty increases, as evictions increase, as healthcare is diminished for folks who are cut off from jobs and housing, the wear and tear is going to be startling. And I'm not sure that we have built communities of mutual aid that are going to be able to sustain organizers in the long haul. Working with folks who were part of the civil rights movement, I know that for many people, the trauma was never addressed. Folks were hurrying to the next thing. They were being brave and bold and moving on. but that trauma is still imprinted in their bodies and their souls. And so part of my concern is what we're doing to really help support and provide aid to communities who are going to be harder hit than this month, next month, and the month after that.
And so I've been doing some work with folks at North Philly Peace Park, which is an urban garden in North Philadelphia. And this is they feed, we grow produce there to feed the community. And I'm realizing that this is the kind of model that, creating these green spaces, these nutritional oases, and these expanding food deserts, in these concrete jungles, right? It's going to be the model that a lot of communities may need to survive, as grocery stores disappear, as everything Janet just lifted up is taking place with the mass evictions that are on the rise. But I'm not quite sure that people in the community have bought into the idea, even in the movement, right, into this model enough. I think that what we're seeing in the movement, there may be this idea that somehow we can affect the kind of change just from protesting in the streets, right? And so this is why I lift up the motto of, instead of taking the streets, we're taking the lots. The streets is good, for attracting attention, for creating ethical spectacles and so on and so forth. But you don't build lasting power on the asphalt. You build lasting power in the soil. And I'm not quite sure the movement has gotten to that point yet, that after all the protests and after all the, we can't protest in the streets 24/7. We have to get down to brick and mortar work, of building community power. We have to get down to creating these new models, that render the old models obsolete. And I'm not quite sure if we're all quite there yet. Sure, tearing down the statues and doing these things, it's all good, but it has to be more than cosmetic changes. And that's what I'm kind of worried about. I'm also worried about the burnout. I'm also worried about the emotional fatigue, and all of those things. So another thing I'm worried about is, this is on the educational piece, and I heard David Abram, he lifted up best in this piece that I strongly urge everybody to read. It's in Emergence magazine. And the piece is called "In the Ground of Our Unknowing." And he talks about, how with what COVID-19 has reduced us to, like what we're doing on this call, where it has taken the flesh and blood interaction out of our daily lives, right? And now we're doing things this way, and that potentially becoming the norm, even in the midst of this movement, could be very harmful. I think the way he articulated was so profound. If you would just bear with me, he said, some people say, wow, the coronavirus is a fast track to the future. Once we see that we can enact much of our lives online, why should we go back to doing things in the far less efficient world of flesh and blood interactions? And in the New York Times, one columnist suggested that once we've learned how to conduct most college courses over the internet, why would we ever want to go back to sitting and lecturing in classrooms? Meanwhile, he said that his son in the 10th grade is jumping out of his skin with boredom at the doldrum and dullness of screen imprisoned classes. And his daughter, abruptly forced home from her blissful freshman year at college, is despairing at the drab inanity of college seminars without the delicious bustle of seeing and hearing and especially feeling her classmates as they reflectively tussle with one another and with the professor while puzzling out problems together. And, you know, it goes on to, you know, he goes on to really flesh that out. I really advise, I strongly urge everybody check that piece out. But those are things that has me worried, you know, about this scenario pulling us further apart from each other, and that the only time we get together is in the streets when we're protesting and taking lumps from the police, and, you know, but in our normal lives, we're not together. That our only times of coming together will be in times of anger and in times of, you know what I'm saying? But not just to enjoy life and just hang out. You know what I'm saying? I think that's going to be that's a dreadful picture. You know, it's full of foreboding.
Donnie, before we go on, you referenced two things, right?
Yeah.
The piece from Emergence magazine, and what was the other piece? New York Times?
Yeah.
And could you tell us more about that? Citation?
Yeah, no, it was well, actually the piece was citing the New York Times, right? That the piece by David Abram was citing the New York Times. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. All right. So Ajima or Janet, does either of you want to respond or react to anything that Ghani said?
Yeah, I want to reinforce, you know, Gadi's point about we have to do the brick and mortar work. Like, so, you know, being on the asphalt, the protests, you know, the spirit of them are finite in the sense that there's very real sort of emotional and physical limitations, but also that once we bring consciousness to those protests, we need to be in the work of actual action, so that change, as saying, on the soil in the communities that need the actual capacity to actually continue to sort of, you know, build up young people, you know, including people who've been impacted by the system, to be engaged and involved, particularly when we're talking about defunding the police or abolishing the police and looking to alternative systems of and restoration. Who's going to replace that? It has to be the community, but the community itself hasn't been built, and, you know, sort of in some sense, the first time being franchised, that's a lot of work that we need to do there. So there's sort of a long list of work we need to do outside the system to create those alternative models that we need to look to right now. I think we have some examples of that through restorative justice and just looking at sort of indigenous traditions. But I don't think, particularly as an academic, for myself, we've done that intentionally and wholeheartedly to create an agenda around that. But a lot of the work is going back into these communities and making sure that communities are resilient. And I think that's sort of the next frontier. Has always been part of the conversation that we haven't really engaged.
I think in some ways it's, we reach more people, right? I just usually would be part of a conference in July that would be 500 people. We would spend 5 days together, incredible beloved community, thick kind of connections that are made. We put it virtual, online, pieces of it anyway, and reached thousands. So big excitement. Now we reach thousands of people instead of 500. But I can't figure out what community holds those folks and holds them accountable. To whom do we report then? To whom are we held to some account for actually doing something about what we've just talked about? And I think that especially goes to when you think of inside out in prisons. I mean, most prisons will not allow any kind of internet connection. I'm doing all my courses by mail correspondence. And it's a killer, right? Because now those in power can hide the abuses for longer than they could before. We have no access to get in and see what's really happening. We have no access to confront people. I can't even drop off materials at the prison. And I think that works in all kinds of ways. We can't do court watch anymore. When juveniles are called up, we can't be in the courtroom because the courtrooms are closed. That's done online. And I think that while there are opportunities, there are these huge dangers for this limited contact in person.
Well, that leads actually to the next question, which is, most of the protest activity and the national conversation has been about police violence. we all work in prisons, and we can easily see the connection between police violence and the violence of the rest of our entire criminal system, not to mention the violence of our racial hierarchy more generally. What do you think are the best ways to connect those for folks who don't see the links?
Mhm.
Go ahead,
So,
Connie.
yeah, so no, that right there is like such a crucial question. Really appreciate it. I think what I've been doing, I don't know if it's effective or what, but is trying to draw this contrast between public safety and public health. All right. And it seems as if, you know, this is something that has started to come up more since COVID-19 hit. You know, how the DOC have, you know, the Department of Corrections, they have chosen to address this public health crisis using public safety measures, right? And public safety rationale and public safety arguments, right? By locking everybody down, right? In the guise of keeping everybody safe. But we're dealing with a public health crisis, and it's no way to contain this crisis by just locking people down, you know, because the way that the virus got in the prison to begin with is, you know, through guards. You know, they had been stopped volunteers, they had been stopped visits. So the only way that the virus could get in and out and recycled in and out of the prison is through the guards and the staff. And so the public safety approach is inadequate. And broadening that, that the way the system is addressing this whole crisis, and even, you know, in their response to our movement to free the vulnerable, right? Our calls to free people who are especially vulnerable to the virus, people over 65, people who have geriatric illness, people who have even terminal illness. Their response is, well, if we really, these people have they are violent cases. When the governor, you know, said that he was going to when he said he was going to do his reprieve, when he announced his reprieve order, it excluded people with violent cases for public safety concerns, right? And so my thing has been how to show the inadequacy of a public safety approach in this narrative where we're facing a global pandemic, right? And connecting that to the police, you know, and how the police responds to things, you know, and so on and so forth. I don't know if it's entirely effective, but being able to imagine things through a lens of public health, where we get down to where we look at root causes, and we also look at, well, how the way we respond to things, is it going to be about promoting and preserving the health of our community and society? I think that's the conversation, me personally, that I'd like to see the society having more. And that to connect and that's how we make the links, you know, because this public safety approach is what? 3 tools: more police, right? More prisons, and harsher laws.
Najima, Janet?
Yes, I think one strategy, this is just very self-serving because I'm an educator, but I try to do this in the classroom, is to talk about, you know, key to Gandhi's point about the interdisciplinary approach we need to take when we think about just our models for responding to human behavior. So right now, the system itself, criminal justice system, is predicated on a philosophy of revenge, if you think about it, right? Care or health, as Gandhi was saying. And the police are just the tip of that. They're just the gatekeepers of a long system, right, that takes an individual, or even generations of people, through many years of a process that at each different stage, from courts to incarceration to probation and parole and even reentry, that entire system is predicated on something being restored or repaired, or we're not providing for people's health and then the eventual health of the communities that they return to. So I think it starts with just, you know, just helping people realize that if we're talking about just focusing on the police, we're doing more of a disservice to ourselves than we realize, because you're only looking at one sort of narrow aspect of it. The police are the representatives of the state. They enact the policies that, elected officials and populist movements that are predicated on punitive punishment put into place. And that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. We're just scratching the surface there. So I think in terms of a strategy, it starts with just educating other people, particularly like the work you do Inside Out, talking about different models. Why isn't that the 2.2 million people that are incarcerated in this country, and we think globally, that when you go into an institution like that, it's not purely about education. It's not purely about restore and repair and becoming truly a different individual as opposed to what it is right now. I think it's also about educating people about the different models we need to import into the system itself, including how policing can be different and police can be truly a servant sort of type of tool for communities themselves, as opposed to being the response or the leaders in how public safety or public health is imposed upon communities as opposed to a coordination effort. So I think the strategy that I'm going to lean on the most is just, and I think that what that speaks to this group here in Inside Out, is the importance of discourse and dialogue. Yes, that forces us to have to push our imagination about different models, but then also to educate other and everywhere we go, particularly young people, particularly students, that this is a larger system with different stages in which we need to be cognizant about the different ways in which there's different steps to change how the entire system operates, or how we're training correctional officers, how we're incarcerating people, having people do with their time while they're incarcerated, and so forth. I think if we just settle on this idea, and this goes back to our earlier question about what's a concern, is that if you think that if we're just talking about reforming police or doing something to police, that we're good, we're done. We've ignored an entire system that also needs to be addressed as well. And this is just sort of a radical idea I have, is that just focusing on, that middle stage of, incarceration. Laura, this, I've talked about this. It's always been sort of like this ideal of mine of that, especially for higher ed, 2.2 million people, that's a huge student population there. Why aren't we servicing them? Why aren't we going in there? Why aren't we literally breaking down those walls?
So why?
Why? So the cynical response is that we're not doing that because it goes back to that ethic of, we are more concerned, it's easier to implement revenge than it is to have someone who's, committed a crime that we've defined as criminal to actually, put aside sort of that revenge ethic, that the sort of the victimization of trauma, which I am recognizing is real and is important to acknowledge and understand, but it's very hard to recognize someone's humanity in that process. So it's easy just to met out punishment and to literally segregate people from our lives and forget about it. It's just easier. And if you want to bring in a conversation about white supremacy, then absolutely. It's about continuing to oppress people that defy the norms of, this machinery of whiteness. And I don't talk about whiteness in terms of skin tone, but this logic of there's a certain sort of style, manner, and culture of being that's possible for people to succeed in this country, this capitalistic society, and globally. It's not, so in that sense, it's not good business, right? It doesn't reinforce the racial hierarchy that James talked about in his questions, and it forces us to confront what the sort of the atrocities that we've perpetuated as a human race, particularly people who have benefited from it. And I think that's a lot more. It's very hard to do that. So it's easier just to continue the pattern of historically this cycle of oppression, of keeping the same place.
Gandhi, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. We have made some strides over the past 4 months. Well, really, we've made strides over the past years that's became evident, even at the outset of this COVID-19 crisis. We know that traditionally in this country, historically, that people who are incarcerated was never a part of a conversation about emergency management. All right. Whenever crisis hit or catastrophes hit, even if they were natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, or Hurricane Harvey, that had a storm surge, you know, and at the time when when all of those hurricanes hit, John and I on this call, John Pace, we were still on the inside. And I remember the storm surge for Superstorm Sandy was 13.3 feet or something like that. And then Hurricane Harvey was 12 feet. That's at the ceiling of the cell that I was in at the bottom. If that flood or that surge had happened at Greater Ford on Collegeville, I'd be floating around in the cell dead. You know what I'm saying? And so I had to think about from a very real way, like, wow, and looking at TV and seeing footage, you know, watching the news, seeing the weatherman holding on to a pole and his coat flapping in the wind, and he's yelling to the top of his lungs, and you're seeing caravans of people evacuating. We never saw prison buses carrying people in that caravan, carrying people out of prisons. And so never was there a conversation was how these things impact, you know, people who are trapped in their cells. Whether it was a man-made nature, a natural disaster, or something like 9/11, or even the outbreak before of Ebola, the Ebola scare. And so the fact that today we're talking about how COVID-19 impacts incarcerated people, and that's front and center. And even though the governor's reprieve was pathetic, the fact that he was pressured to do that is a stride. You know, it is a stride. The United Nations even urged the rest of the world, you know, and specifically the US, to begin decarcerating in the face of this pandemic, right? I think Turkey released some 90,000 people of their 300,000 prison population, almost a third of their population. Iran have already released, you know, well over 54,000 now. You know, all over the world, people are decarcerating, right? And so, you know, I think and that's a global thing. That's an international thing. And so I just think that we need to be clear of the strides that we have made in our educational process and in our movement about this moment. I think that's an important piece to making the link.
Let me interrupt at this point. James, did you rejoin us? Okay, I got a message that he did. I guess not. Okay, Janet, do you want to pick up a little bit? Do you have anything you want to say?
I think I agree with both Jima and Ghani. I think on the one hand, the institutions have an invested interest in keeping things the same. And so there will be a lot of performance pro forma kind of actions, changing the name on a building without changing the structure inside. And on the other hand, I think there have been huge new understandings of the criminal legal system. I think in particular, when you look at communities that have released a number of folks from cages and the crime level has dropped. It has not gone up, it has dropped. And so it exposes the lies behind the system. I think the fact that the Movement for Black Lives Breathe Act is specifically, intentionally including the voices of those who are caged or have been caged, and saying that's the only way we can fashion this kind of legislation to really change the whole structure, not just do one or two things, and for sure not do reform on a system that ought not to be reformed, but dismantled, reimagined completely our approach to this kind of stuff. And I think that thinking back to the history, we call it at the Children's Defense Fund, the cradle to prison pipeline, because we think people are targeted from birth, communities are targeted. And if we think back, this is a key moment to think back to Nixon, to the reaction after Dr. King's assassination, to the criminalization of Black power, the criminalization of community mobility and kind of mutual aid that was going on, the criminalization of gangs, the naming of gangs, the kind of not reckoning with economic shifts, but really intentionally criminalizing whole communities for the sake of some folks holding on to their power. And I think that while we are at a moment that possible radical change is possible, so is possible radical slashback and a renewed, and I think it's already happening, a renewed kind of criminalization, a renewed kind of martial force in the cities, violence that has gone unheeded. Yeah.
The criminalization of Black power piece, I think is critical, because there is a growing criticism about the criminalization of Black resistance, and which has caused like a resurgence in the campaign to free political prisoners just within the last 4 months, right? And even here in Philadelphia, where you hear, you know, there's an outcry about, okay, well, you tore down the statue of Frank Rizzo. That's all well and good, but let's go further. How about Frank Rizzo's victims? You know, people who resisted Frank Rizzo that are still rotting away in prison, you know, almost 50 years later. You know, when we talk about Russell Maroon Schultz, and we talk about Fred Burton, and we talk about the Move 9, you know, all of that happened under Frank Rizzo. And so people are making the connections. You know what I'm saying? And the issue of political prisoners is not just something to look at like we're just talking about some old, a handful of people who are still in prisons, but they're on their verge, they're on their way out. Some of them are terminally ill. But political prisoners is going to be this new thing that we're going to have to deal with, because people who are rounded up in those protests, people who are arrested for protesting, they are by definition all political prisoners. So there is a new generation of political prisoners right now in prison. You know what I'm saying? For being in the streets, protesting over the last 4 weeks. And so there is no, and there are political prisoners now because of resisting the police. So it's impossible to disconnect the relationship between the police and the prison system.
Angela, Bryant, you have a question that you wanted to ask. So rather than me read it, why don't you just ask the question that you want to ask? But you need to, there you go.
Sure, I will. I'm just interested in hearing about efforts in this moment of the Black Lives Matter movement to actually change some of the narratives and relationships with DOCs in our states regarding inside out programming, classes offered, what they're getting from us instead of always being on this receiving end of kind of, you know, faltering to what they need and how we can operate in that context. So I'm interested in hearing if folks have been engaging in any resistance or efforts to change these relationships and narratives with their state DOCs.
Yeah, definitely, Angie. Good to see you too. And we can do a lot better on that, Angie, for real. And this is a struggle that's going on within the movement. We had a community conversation this Thursday with Professor Rachel Lopez. Rachel Lopez, you know, she's, you know, connected to Inside Out as well. She's a Drexel Law professor. And when I say we, I'm talking about the Amistad Law Project that I work with, collaborated with her and Drexel's Andy Gwen Community Lawyering Clinic on this report that we released about 2.5 weeks ago, called Pandemic in PA's Prisons. And one of the things, I mean, it's a very, very thorough report. One of the things that we lift up in there is, and in the conversation around it, is how, like, since the uprising, the issue of people, you know, dealing, you know, threatened by this COVID-19 virus on the inside has kind of like faded to the back, you know, and that right there doesn't bode well for our folks on the inside. And so our movement, even with all that we just said, you know, about making the connections, you know, we're not doing that at nearly the pace that we need to do it on. We're lagging far behind. The movement needs to bring this issue front and center, you know, and we need to really get down to doing what you're talking about too, Angie, how the movement could support, you know, the educational process behind the walls, especially, you know, inside out and stuff like that. We haven't really had that conversation in the movement. And so thank you for lifting that up.
Hey, Angie, nice to see you. We've tried several things. DOC has pushed back because colleges are not reconvening classes. So how are they going to allow anybody to participate in an inside out class? We have made gains in some areas. We have trained mediators through inside out classes inside both the low side and also death row. They're certified, they're used, and they have been increasingly powerful as other folks are not intervening. Emotions are high, visits are cut off. Folks are really struggling with the threat of so many things coming their way, and mediation has been key, and so Department of Corrections has begun to look then anew at some of the things that we were doing. So I think we're kind of a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a little bit of good news, a little bit of bad news, but we're pushing.
Ajima, did you want to say anything or no?
I'm good. I don't have any, I'm not actually on the ground working any movements, unfortunately. My service is committed elsewhere, but I had an idea in terms of, you know, essentially the shadows that, you know, institutions get to operate behind because we don't focus on them enough, particularly in these kind of sort of, you know, the social and racial reckoning is maybe, you know, perhaps for higher ed, which, you know, as someone who works in the industry isn't known to be a leader, is to, if there is, you know, an educational incentive, right, to reinforce programs like Inside Out and including college degree programs that are there in light of the Pell Grant Initiative, is for higher ed to push and to lobby for that access. And if we have to go back to correspondence because of COVID-19 and because of the digital divide, then we should do that. I think more than ever, we need to be empowered and motivated by the things that are barriers and to think creatively to work outside of them. And I think right now there's a lot of money circulating around racial justice and social justice. And I think it just takes some initiative, and I think higher ed can play, and even just other educational programs can play in providing that imagination to continue this work and to have those conversations, to Angela's point, inside facilities about Black Lives Matter while people are incarcerated as well. So it's, for me, it's just more sort of a creative strategy to think about, and someone taking the effort to lead that movement. I think prisons, you know, institutions, detention facilities, they benefit from this sort of, you know, being in the shadow of conversations as it concerns, you know, policing, right? They benefit from that, from being forgotten in some sense.
Angela, do you want to respond in any way? You good?
No, thank you everybody for sharing. It's really great to see you all too. So sorry I didn't say that in the beginning. Thank you all.
So what other kinds of, oh, go ahead, Donnie.
No, something just occurred to me, and it just popped in my head, and I'm gonna just throw it out there to see what y'all think about it. But maybe there's a way to, I don't know, just some way to add some pressure by, you know, they're doing virtual visits now. You know what I'm saying? They've been doing virtual visits for the past 4 months or so on the inside. Maybe there's a way to, you know, to push for some virtual courses. You know what I'm saying? Here's the thing. Here's the thing. I'm not saying that we just got finished talking about the problem with that out here. You know, we hope that's not our future. But I'm just saying it's a way to put some pressure on them to not just think that, you know, they're just going to proceed the way they're going to proceed without some kind of, you know, pestering from the outside, without some kind of pressure from the outside. You know, at least guys could come out of their cell, or women can come out of their cells, you know what I'm saying? And maybe go to a room where it might be less of them in order to socially distance,
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, Gani. Next week, we are going to have our first Zoom-based training. It's going to be a 6-day training. And the folks who are doing the part of the, so to say, inside students are formerly incarcerated students, all from Graterford. And we just met yesterday to do a kind of train the trainers. So it will be very interesting to see, given how interactive and you know, fill in the blanks. I mean, Inside Out is so heavy on connections between people. It'll be really interesting to see how this training goes, where the whole thing is going to be on Zoom. So that'll be a little bit of a, I mean, it's a thing unto itself, but it'll also be a little bit of a test in terms of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But one of the concerns is that, you know, the impact of students going through the security measures, having to pay attention to the officers, being yelled at for not being in line, putting up with the restrictions. I mean, the physical experience of what it means to be caged is not going to be found online.
It's not going
No.
it's not
going to be found online. They're not going to have that moment when they say, whoa,
Right.
we're going home, but you're going to hear the door slam.
Right.
And so I think, I mean, it always struck me that you could have folks who are about to graduate with majors in sociology or political science or whatever, who had no clue about this criminal legal system, not the slightest idea, who were suddenly awakened by being inside this prison, by learning with and from, that the power of that proximity, the forced reevaluation of how people learn and who has wisdom is hard to replicate if you're not in the prison.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not to discourage the effort. I mean, it's, yeah. But I'm hungry to be back in the prison.
So Amy Schuster, you have a question? Do you want to ask it?
Hi, sorry. I just came from working out, so I apologize for not looking as professional as I would like to. I would love to hear about how people are thinking about Inside Out's policy about not being a whistleblowing program, and how we talk to students that we're recruiting from the inside and outside about how we're not a whistleblowing program, with this other thing that I think we all are committed to, which is really radical revolutionary change. I appreciate any wisdom and insight you guys can offer me. Thanks.
Anybody want to speak to that?
I can probably speak to an example of it. I'm not formally involved in Inside Out yet. I get to go through the training. It's good to learn that. Sorry, my cat wants to be part of our conversation. Here she goes. But I feel that tension as a criminologist, where I have to do research on behalf of the powerless sometimes. So there's a tension I have to navigate in terms of my relationships with police, with courts, with departments of corrections, with probation officers. I need access. In order to have that access, I have to, sort of toe a fine line, not to be a whistleblower, call things out. But that wouldn't be true to a lot of the things I think are necessary for structural change. I think just like in the nature of politics, it's going to be a process. It's going to be one, I think, to quote Gani earlier, of sort of ebbs and flows. There are going to be setbacks and there can be gains. But I think in this current, this post-Floyd George era, and what his death in COVID-19 presents to us in terms of a lesson for our humanity, is that we may need to step off that ledge and think differently, more creatively, how we actually negotiate that space. Because it's not enough to sort of maintain, but begin to sort of push that envelope, apply that pressure, as Gani said. And then one strategy I've sort of used in my own department when I'm trying to sort of appeal to my colleagues about something is to help people see your vision, see what you're trying to actually accomplish here, and then give them time to sort of settle with it. And in some sense, it's becoming a politician, which I hate to say, you know, regard politics to be something that is the most safe space for all of us. But I think that's what we're ultimately talking about in terms of being able to push for change and to change the status quo. We're going to have to disrupt it in a very careful way. And so I think the key tool is reflexivity is needed. You need to understand in how you operate in this. Since you might also help perpetuate it because of the way you operate within the way it currently exists. But then having to use, you know, the tools that we try to teach through education is your imagination and other models of how to actually change and begin to slowly sort of, maybe not slowly, but hopefully, you know, with time, change that status quo and start with, you know, what we've seen recently with sort of progressive prosecutors, right? You might have progressive departments of corrections and wardens that are going to be sensitive to understand that. And I know as a criminologist that educates the next generation of practitioners, that is my goal in the classroom, to get them to be more sensitive and empathetic to you're going to be part of a system that has a lot of problems, but you can help operate in a different manner. So it's a tough question, and it's one that I grapple with every day in my profession, for sure.
Yeah, I think this is a situation where we're going to have to be very imaginative and very creative about, you know, and how we approach that particular point. I think, yeah, we do need things to be exposed from behind the walls, right? That because what's happening right now is behind the walls is unconscionable. You know, we're hearing about it from the phone calls that we're getting on the inside. It's really a harrowing ordeal that our folks behind the walls are going through. And what's not really getting enough attention and consideration in this whole narrative since COVID-19 is the mental health implications about all of this, how all of this is impacting the mental health of our people behind the walls. You know what I'm saying? We're talking about, we're over 4 months into this right now. We're talking about the longest prison lockdown, statewide lockdown, at least in Pennsylvania. I don't know how it is in other parts of the country, in the state's history. And I'm talking about the strongest among us. I'm talking to him on the phone, and it's starting to, there's that attrition, you know, it's starting to like wear away at certain people. You know what I'm saying? And so we're going to have to figure out, we need to be able to get in there because we're locked out. We need to be able to get in there. And so it's going to have to be those who want to get in there have to be able to get in there. And those can't be the whistleblowers. You know what I'm saying? But those who have no interest in going back in and want to blow the whistle, then they should be free to blow the whistle to expose things, but it can't be connected to those who are going in there. You know what I'm saying? It can't be connected to inside out. Right now, we're locked out. We need to get back in there. We need to get back in there to give moral support, to let our folks know that we're still with you. We haven't forgotten you. You know what I'm saying? And just to help, you know, just to help hold them up and to let them know that the struggle is continuing on the outside on their behalf and to change the narrative, right? And so those who are going back inside can be doing the whistleblowing. It's plain and simple. So we're going to have to wear different hats. We're going to have to be very thoughtful, very strategic about that, you know, but what's going on the inside definitely need to be exposed. And maybe it's not the educators to do the exposing. We might need to find a way to get the voices of the people on the inside out. You know what I'm saying? Through recordings over the phone or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Let them, and smuggle those words to freedom, right? One of our inside out, was somebody on the inside, a couple people, because they do the virtual visits now, their families are recording them. You know? And this is not connected to any program. This is just their personal visits. Their families are recording them and they're giving testimonies from behind the walls, and their families are posting it on Facebook, on social media. This is something that was unforeseen before COVID-19. And so You know, so there are ways to get, to expose the system without exposing the folks that we want to be able to get back in there, like our folks from inside out. We got to be really creative, and we have to be wise.
Janet, you want to weigh in on that?
Oh, this is my ongoing struggle as someone who has been going into prison since 1975, been kicked out of more than one. I think possibly that building relationships is the key. Everybody in the Department of Corrections who knows me knows that we will call when things go wrong. We will out when things are not responded to. We will figure out a way to get the news into the community. And they let us go in because there's a big enough community to hold folks accountable, and they know it's not me, and it's not one school, and it's not 5 people. It's a thick community that really is involved day to day in what happens in the state, what happens in the city, and does not, is unwilling to accept either silence or non-response to problems that are going on. So when the tornado hit in Nashville on March 3rd and folks went without water, and we knew that, we figured out a way to get it in the press and to get a response. Yeah, so I think there are ways to do it. I think Donnie's right. I'm not convinced that those of us who are part of Inside Out, who go in all the time, can't be folks who confront people in power with the gross violations of human rights.
That's right, that's right.
And the inadequate responses to ongoing trauma and pain. I think we cannot be silent.
I just had an idea. I just wanted
Go ahead, Ajima.
to put forward. I was just inspired with what Janet and Ghani were saying. Is has anyone thought about the utility of virtual, particularly attached to a digital scholarship center at an institution of higher education, where and I don't think money or resources would be an issue here, because there should be funding there or an effort to enable that. But as someone who's taken advantage of that in my own classroom to help students understand the reality around North Philadelphia, I've been able to sort of capture video of neighborhoods and bring that into the classroom. And so maybe with existing relationships with the various DOCs, you can sort of set up that same process where you have a student on the inside. This is the life, this is the reality that you can't necessarily have right now physically because of restrictions around COVID-19 and any other departmental restrictions, but that students sort of have that connection, albeit it's a virtual digital one. But the idea just popped in my head about a way to sort of transcend, this current circumstances of not being able to be on the inside and to be aware of, what's going on, the conditions, and not able to have those conversations. I think more than ever, technology is something to be harnessed right now. And like I said, I think now is the right time to think about how, in the spirit of, wanting to address, the sort of systemic racism and oppression, there's a lot of people that are looking for, I think that would entertain, I should say, foundations and other organizations, these sort of creative ideas that sort of bridge that gap.
Donnie and I saw a virtual reality piece at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. Incarcerated Children's Network has done some work with that. That was, I thought, was quite powerful. I'm not sure what you got.
Yeah, it was powerful.
Okay. Are there other questions that folks have? Just to let us know, there's just 10 minutes left. So what sorts of other questions have been sparked by this conversation? Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, well, people are thinking, I just want to push for anybody who's part of any faith community. I believe that theology is the problem at the moment. I'll claim churches since that's my background. But I believe that faith communities who stand at a distance from folks who are being hardest hit become theological justifiers for the systems, which is why we create a charitable kind of approach to things, which is 99% of prison ministry. And so one of the hopes I have is that Inside Out will challenge and change the whole theology behind prison ministry, which has been an absolute disaster. I think some of you maybe met Ndume Olatoshani, my colleague. Anyway, Ndume was on Tennessee's death row for 20 years for a crime he did not commit. And he used to say all those years, church folks coming in trying to save my soul. Hell, I didn't need anybody save my soul. I need somebody save my ass. And I think the redefining, you know, there's just so much energy that goes into this prison ministry stuff.
So Janet, let me ask you a
Yes,
question. How, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. How could we go about doing that?
Oh, I have so many ideas. Yeah, one of the things that we've done is create a consortium of theological educational schools, seminaries, to redefine everything through the lens of kids who are on the margins, which is the cradle to prison pipeline. And so if you start in that place, it shifts. And there is a national effort to do that with a variety of faith communities, and there are denominations who do it. But I think the bigger push is a movement that is led, defined by folks who have been caged, are caged now, to say, these are the folks, this is the community who will accompany you in this redefinition and who will hold you accountable for actually making the change happen.
Okay, now let me read this. Tarmi from Australia, it's 6 a.m. there, and she doesn't want to speak because her son is sleeping next to her. She just asked, does anyone have connections with youth who are incarcerated?
We do, our team does, and we cannot get in to see them, but we have gotten a number of folks released to community care and have pushed back on some of the arrests that have been made, and have been working with the juvenile court judge who believes in transformative justice, and we have a new wing going on with restorative justice inside juvenile court. So yeah, we've been listening to the kids who are terrified.
So I, a half hour before I joined you all on this panel discussion, I had just wrapped up my second session in a 2-week training with Impact Justice for a new position with YASP, the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project, where and this position is going to be as a restorative justice diversion facilitator, where I'll be kind of like doing what Daniel Serrett and Common Justice is doing in Brooklyn, New York, but with young people, with youth, where the district attorney is going to be turning over cases to us, and we'll be, I guess, bringing the young people who've caused the harm or whatever, or the offense, face to face with the people that they may have offended, and facilitating the whole restorative justice, reconciliation, accountability process. And so I got about another week and a half or so of training to do, and then I'll be starting that position. And so I'll be working really closely with young people behind the walls, in the jails anyway, not the state prison, but in the jails.
Other comments or questions? And people can just speak them. That you don't have to do it on the chat.
So I know we have only 5 minutes left, right, Laurie?
I think that's right.
Yeah. And so I don't know. I just think it's important to lift up, something that's been just reverberating in my spirit about this time being a great spiritual awakening, not necessarily something religious, even though that might play a part for a lot of people, but just awakening to the connectivity and the connection between each of us to one another and to our planet. I think what we're seeing is a thrust, in this movement, we're seeing a thrust to to improve the human experience, a thrust to become more fully human. You know, how each of us could become more fully human. I think it's also a moral reckoning, and it's also a moment of liberation for our imagination and for our tongues. And you know, I got a fetish for quotes, Laurie and everybody, but but
Yes, we do know that.
the one that's been resonating in my head for a very long time is something that Frederick Douglass said in his famous 4th of July speech. What to the slave is your 4th of July. And this is what he said in response to people that one was asking him, why didn't he engage in more persuasive arguments and use language that was more palatable to the ears of his audience? And mind you, his audience at the time the speech was delivered, July 5th, 1852, his audience was predominantly slaveholders. You know what I'm saying? And so he responded, you know, first he said, why should I have to convince anybody that slavery is wrong? He said, I will denounce slavery, America's greatest sin, with every emphasis I can muster. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command. And that's the piece that sticks out for me, severest language, because he would go on, and here's the actual quote. He said, quote, and think about today as you hear this. He said, quote, at a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and humankind must be proclaimed and denounced, end quote. And so for me, that's the legacy I want to attach myself now in this moment more than ever, is that legacy of not mincing any words. You know, this is a time for calling, not just calling a spade, but calling a spade a fucking spade.
Okay. That was awesome, of course. And I wonder if you can, again, tell us kind of how we can find that.
That's just look up, you know, Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We need to move towards wrapping up, so I'm wondering if, and would you consider, Johnny, that you're kind of wrapping up what you just did? What you just shared with us?
Yeah, well, that's my piece.
Okay, so Ajima and Janet, if you would, do you have any last words you want to share with the group?
I just want to take the opportunity to say thanks to Inside Out. Thanks to Laurie for all the years of persistence and passion and creative change. It's a gift to be connected with everybody on this call, and I'm honored. So yeah, we keep going.
Thank you. Ajima?
Likewise, you know, thank you, Lori, Celeste. I'm sorry, not Celeste. David, I was looking at Celeste and Eileen for organizing this panel. And this very important conversation, for shedding the light on, you know, the role of prisons in this conversation, because we have ignored, you know, other aspects of the larger conversation about, you know, justice. I think the last few thoughts that I will share with everyone is just something that I'm trying to meditate on daily, is just to resist, you know, continue to resist thoughtfully and carefully, you know, to, you know, remember self-care and love and that of others. Don't get comfortable. The status quo is deceiving, and I think as long as that we're still struggling and we're still having these conversations, we have work to do, and we need to begin to work of using our imagination, and looking to other models that we normally wouldn't, to think about where we want to be in the next generation, the next century.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank the three of you. I think this was a fabulous conversation. I'm not at all surprised. That's what I anticipated. I'm just so sorry that James was not able to be with us. So maybe next time. And for anybody who knows someone who wanted to be on this call and wasn't able to make it, we will be sending the recording out, and so you can share it with other folks. All right. So thank you all, and enjoy the crazy weather if you're on the East Coast.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, everybody. Janet, Ajima, T.E.
All right.
Thank you.
Angie,
Bye.
everybody, Romy, Lauren. All right.
Bye, Janet, Lori, Gani.
right.
Thank you, everyone.
Peace,
Thank
everybody.
you, Connie.
All right, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you.